It's a pretty decent spring day. And we'll be talking about seed starting and transplants and the the intimidating process, or what can be an intimidating process of bringing them from that teeny tiny little seed up to a plant that can actually go out into the garden and thrive and succeed, as opposed to just
Introduce yourself.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm Kevin Cannon. For those of you who haven't been at other talks and things, I live right up on New Prospect. I've been there for many decades with my family. Been gardening for decades at this point. And yeah, I think that's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've started a lot of seeds, and I have also failed at a lot of seed starting, and that those are the best ways to, or the best learning experiences, or the most impactful learning experiences I've had with growing seeds are the utter failures. We're trying to find your way around them. And my hope is that by the end of tonight, you'll have a list of things that will help you bypass and not have to deal with some of the really common failures that happen when people are first starting out and trying these things. And yeah, I found when I was trying to make notes for this talk, the other two that I've given before now, the general flow of the talk just made sense as to what I would be talking about and how it would go from thing to thing. And despite the fact that right now, like I was saying before, I've already put hundreds and hundreds of seeds into the soil. I've already done the process I'm going to be talking about in a second. 3 or 4 flats or larger things. So I've done a lot of it already, and still found myself going, how do I talk about this? It was like, I don't know, like a container, and you put some soil in it, and you put some seed in it, and you use some water, you put it in some light, and in its most basic form, that is actually all that's required for it. But you can use that same equation and mostly wind up with failures at the end of it, just because the container is off or the soil is off, and there's each one of those things. There are nuances and things that'll just make things either work better or will tend towards failure, or you'll wind up with weak transplants that when you try to put them outside. So gonna try to help with that tonight. First, I just want to geek out a little bit about seeds, because seeds are magnificent. They're these teeny tiny little, or sometimes they're bigger than teeny tiny little, but they can be the size of dust. And in that, there's a tree that is just waiting to pop out. Or anything from a very small plant all the way up to a tree. And it seems, I find no matter how many times I do it, it still seems impossible and feels impossible each time. Or it's an act of faith almost, that like you just have to trust that it is actually going to happen, because you've watched it happen a bunch of times before, but it still feels almost impossible. In starting your own transplants and planting your own seeds and saving seeds, you're participating in a tradition that goes back thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, through all of our ancestors and the ancestors of all of our brothers and sisters around the world. It's deep. It's very, very human, and it does things to us. But in that act, and I think this, as I was reflecting on, how do I even talk about this? I realized that, like, in that act of, you could say, faith, or this seemingly unbelievable thing, you put the seed into the soil for both, on one hand, the act is infused with and imbued with hope that that seed is going to turn into a small plant, that then the next year it's the hope for whether it's beautiful flowers or scented things or fruits, or maybe a tree that lasts for hundreds of years, or whatever that is. But along with that, there's the fears that come with any time you're taking care of a small thing, of what the problems could be, or what the unknowns could be. So there's like both hope in the unknowns as well as that fear. And I think part of the reason that seed starting and transplants and that sort of topic often gets really confusing, or we grab onto information that might not be, anytime that humans are when an act is mostly based on hope and fear, differentiating between fact and fiction sometimes can be tough, because we're grasping kind of whatever we can do. And so you will hear countless ways of how to start seeds and things like that, because somebody had success in just this one way and it might not work in all of the other, but again, trying to bypass or help you guys bypass at least a little bit of that. And that seeds also come in so many different forms because there's so many different types of plants. And most wild plants that you're dealing with, or the seeds that are produced by wild plants, in that crop of seeds that's produced in a pine cone, let's say, or on a lamb's quarters, there's a certain percentage of those seeds that will germinate the next year. And then there's a certain percentage, or most of them, are actually covered in varying degrees and levels of different types of resins and waxes and different compounds that actually make it so that the seed, it takes a few years of water and freezing and things to slowly break it down so that that one will germinate 2 years later, or 3 years later, or 4. And it's something that allows plants, instead of everything germinating in 1 year, and if it just so happens to be a drought, then that whole genetic line is just gone. It allows for flexibility. But the garden plants that, for the most part, what we're going to be talking about tonight and ways to start them, they've been selected by humans, essentially unintentionally, to kind of have just lost most of those tendencies to have seeds that won't germinate. So most tomatoes at this point, you take a tomato, you take the seeds out, and you put it in the next year, essentially every one of those seeds will germinate. There is nothing that keeps them in, because it just doesn't make sense, or it has been slowly selected out over the course of, in some cases, thousands of years. So the seeds we start, luckily, we have thousands of years of people doing work before us in order to make our jobs a lot easier, and it can still be pretty challenging. But yeah, so the first thing is going to be getting seeds, figuring out what it is that you want to grow, how much of it is, how much space you have, and it's mostly just figuring out how much space you have, whether you're working with just containers or whether there's raised beds, and then in turn, the species you want to grow or the seeds that you already have, and then how many of those can actually fit reasonably into those spaces. Otherwise, sometimes you will wind up with, or I do almost every year, a whole extra flat of tomatoes, because there was already 50 of them already went into the ground, and so then it's a matter of trying to give away 50 tomatoes as fast as possible. You usually can't do it. So seeds, to poll again, would you mostly be looking to be starting vegetable seeds or flower seeds?
Doing both.
Doing both of them? Okay.
Not a lot.
Okay. Flowers. Okay. So my advice on getting seeds is, I usually try. There's a couple of companies. I don't necessarily want to mention the companies on the video and all of that sort of thing. If you're going to be growing in an organic or less fertilizer intense system, you're going to lean towards organic seed companies, or one, because they are raising their seeds in conditions that are more similar to how your garden or containers are going to be. If you're not going to be putting tons of fertilizer on them, or going to try to be more, if you use a lot of Miracle Grow and those sorts of things, then it's a little bit less, a little bit less important. But I will prop the Hudson Valley Seed Company right on the other side of the ridge. They grow amazing seeds. I have never had anything but just complete success. And since they were grown, or a good portion of them are just right on the other side of the ridge, very similar climate to what we're dealing with here, and so when you put them into your garden, since their parents were in such a similar conditions, or as close as possible, they will tend to do a lot better right around here. Which is also another reason why saving seeds is so important, especially in the home garden, that the more you can save seeds, the more that particular vegetable becomes accustomed to your very specific spot and garden. So yeah, and then and pretty much everybody, like, nobody's looking to be planting 100 of any one thing in a flat.
Not on purpose.
Not really good answer. Okay, so then smaller things. Yeah, I mean, also a lot of seed packets actually now have far fewer seeds in them than they used to. And so there's a little bit less of you're not going to be wasting as many seeds probably for small production. But yeah, I go organic almost exclusively, unless they're it's particularly flowers. Like, it's hard to find certain types of like fancy garden flowers, certain types of the xanthus, and just they exist within the organic flower world, but the varieties, the certain types of lilies and things, you gotta go, or I go non-organic for those, and then by the end of the season.
Only if you're gonna eat the flowers.
Yeah, and even then, if it's the seed itself, by the time that is split, or the outside of the seed is split and it's grown and producing fruits,
And you're not putting anything on it that's bad.
Exactly.
Then
Yeah.
you're okay.
Yeah, and so I tend to, if it's something that I can't find organic, I'll go non-organic, and then by the end of the year, or by the time that I'm saving seeds on it in my garden at the end of the year, all of those seeds are organic, and because sometimes you just can't find it in one of the organic catalogs, and then those are the times, but it is flowers in particular are the ones where, if you want to, some of the older garden flowers, or the thing like traditional garden flowers that would have been grown 100 years ago or 150 years ago, there's increasing organic production, but a lot of it is still pretty conventional. But then as a result, also the seeds tend to be sometimes a little bit cheaper, or a little bit less expensive.
That's a question.
Oh yeah.
Did you have a question? I'm
Was there a
sorry.
question?
No,
Oh.
I just looked that way.
And yeah, seeds. Just get seeds, looking around, find what you want to do. The next thing is going to be timing, and the timing of when you're going to be doing the whole transplant process. That each and every plant, or each and every species and different variety, or less varieties, but species in particular, has a different time that it's best to start them, in order to give them enough time to grow so that they're of a decent size to put out in the garden. For example, the onions, I already have onions and leeks, and then I'm doing a garlic seed project that I've also put them in, but like cool alliums are already seeded, but that's because they take a really long time to get to a place where it makes sense to put them in, and then they size up well. Because if I started them in another month or two, you might as well direct seed them in the ground at that point. But I'll be starting brassicas, for example, in another probably week or two, and that's kale and collards and those sorts of things, because they can go out actually before the frost, and then after that will be tomatoes and peppers and the hot weather things. But depending upon what you're growing, usually on that seed packet, or pretty much always on that seed packet, it's going to say when to start inside, and it'll say 6 to 8 weeks or 4 to 6 weeks or something like that. And then it's finding out what your last frost date is. I think most of Pine Bush at this point, I believe, is a 6A. But we also have pockets of what would be considered 5B. These are hardiness zones, and it has to do with average minimum temperature and length of frost days, and average minimum temperature, sorry, let me regather myself. But the main thing that we're concerned with as gardeners is the frost. It's the thing that can wipe out tomato plants in no time, or a lot of plants when they're exposed to them. And so that I want to get this is everything is shifting in some really weird ways. And so having a sense of when that frost is going to happen is getting harder and harder to really be able to have an exact on. Usually our 5B, 6A sort of thing, our last frost in general, oftentimes historical average is sometime at May 8th or something like that. May 8th, maybe within that or a week afterwards. And even then, that's considered it's generally considered after that you're completely fine. Even for a couple weeks before that, you might not get any frosts, and we've experienced it. We have beautiful, and everything kind of falls out and it just doesn't happen. But last year we had a frost on May 25th. I know farmers all around this area who lost all of their tomatoes and all of their peppers, and because it was so far into the season that there wasn't a chance. No way. I had put all of my tomatoes in, all of my peppers, all of my flowers. You remember this because I worked at her house during the daytime and we talked about things, and she mentioned it had been beautiful all day. It was supposed to be beautiful the next day, and she said, "Oh, there's supposed to be a frost tonight." I'm like, what do you mean? Because it's the end of May. And luckily, if you hadn't mentioned that, I would have lost almost everything. All of my tender flowers, because I had put them in, and I even thought that I was being, conservative and kind of holding back by putting them in the week before, maybe the 20th or something. But increasingly, that is, a spin that can kind of be put in at the last minute. So, when you're doing transplants, I would say generally stick to the idea that May 8th or so is about, or roughly, our last frost. But it's knowing that nature does all sorts of other things, and those are just historical averages. And so from there, and you can also, if you hop online and enter in your address and find out the very exact, because each one of us, Pine Bush and Shawngum has a very diverse landscape, and there's colder pockets and warmer pockets. So look up whatever your address is. That will give you a specific. And then, it's counting back however many weeks from whatever that frost date is, or whenever the set out date is. And then you start those seeds on that date. It takes a little bit of research. But if you're only growing a handful of things, it's just that date. Set it back those and then start them then. And that's pretty much all it is on timing. So that's the research part, and now on to the actual thing. So that the container, you can use a lot of things. I was about to say you can use whatever, but you can't use whatever. This year, just to give you some example, I mean, any of these, lots of, leftover takeout trays and things, I would try to keep it to about 2 or at least 2 inches deep, just to give the roots space to grow down. But you, in this, you could grow a whole bunch of different things. You could even do tomatoes and things like that. They tend to wind up a bit, but if you just had one, you would get a decent sized transplant. Right now, in one of these at home, I have my leeks growing, and they're just kind of in strips, but you can take them and just plug them out pretty easily. They transplant really easily. And this is also kind of fun. None of you are going to be growing necessarily on this scale this time around.
I've been saving them too. I've been saving everything.
They
For a
work.
couple of years.
Yeah. If you do something like this, cut the bottom, or you can use scissors too. I'm just roughly
I have
tearing
scissors
it.
if you'd like it. There's
Well,
scissors.
for this,
Yeah.
just fold them in like that at the bottom, and they do tend to dry out if they're isolated from one another. But you could put some drainage in the bottom of this, and if you had or actually, if you're going to stack them in, you would just leave it open, and then at the end, if you want to separate them, you can either close them up at the bottom or something. And what you would do is not just fill the paper towel tubes, you would also fill the space in between them. You might want a container to be a little bit deeper than this, because when that space isn't filled, I've just found they tend to dry out. They take a lot more watering, and as any plants you're growing in there tend to get, or when they get bigger, they're not quite as happy. But otherwise, as long as they're nice and clustered and keep some moisture in them, paper towel tubes are awesome. Because then when you're stripping it apart, even if it's growing in a cluster, if there's still just one in each one of those paper towel tubes, when you do put the 5 or 6 plants out, and you just kind of lift the whole thing up, each one of them really does tear off quite easily from the others, and you're not going to kill the plant or anything. And then you could just plant the whole thing right into the ground. Yeah. You could also use a milk jug. I'm going to talk about this form of seed sowing a little bit later on. We're just going to go through like the basic stuff first, and then this is for something called winter sowing, and it's magnificent. But we'll save it for just a little while. Timing is a container. So we're on to the soil. My recommendation, because everybody is just starting off fresh, just buy a bag of seed starter, like a seed starting mix. If you head down to Beck's, or really any place, I just always get my stuff from Beck's. Get yourself a nice bag of seed starter, because the mixing that's involved, like, you're all just starting off. Get yourself some seed starter because it's mixing that stuff up to get the right recipe, to blend all of the ingredients. It takes a while to get the feel for what it should actually feel like and get all of those recipes. And if you're growing on a small scale too, none of you are going to need a wheelbarrow full of seed starting mix. And yeah, then they have them usually in bags from anywhere from, like this size and kind of sizing all the way up, especially at this time of year. Beck's has everything, or all lawn and garden places and things are going to have pretty much everything. Lights, and depth, I guess, but lights. Well, windows would be really nice. Windows generally don't, even south-facing windows, generally don't produce the healthiest transplants. They, even with full south-facing windows and it gets sun for most of the day, the glazing or the glass just decreases light and does tend to make them, they always want, the seedlings will wind up reaching and making themselves really spindly so that they're weaker when you try to either put them out in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
I also have did it
I
for
have no
years and have done it so many times that it's definitely not a oh, how silly to do that. Like, oh yeah, no, I definitely did that for a long time too. And sometimes it's just the only option you have is to get them in as bright of a spot as possible. But getting either a grow light, something that is specifically for growing plants, or even things like fluorescent lights work. Initially, you can, for especially starting the seeds and their initial growth. I know a lot of farmers and growers that use essentially just fluorescent lights, and grow lights also come in. There's a lot of different types. LED grow lights have become very, very popular. They're tend to be less expensive and produce a lot less heat, use up way less energy. But it's worth investing, or it's worth getting a grow light in order to actually produce. And if you're only going to be starting, this amount of it, or this many plants, or that amount of space, and really there's a lot of even lamps that not the full length grow lights that you'll see in greenhouses and things like that. You can get bulbs, individual bulbs that can be put into a lamp. I've done that plenty of times before, but you are going to need some sort of supplemental light to have really healthy plants. Yeah.
I don't get really any sunlight, direct sunlight at
Okay.
all. So I'm gonna have to start my plants under light.
Definitely. Yeah.
So will the LED lights,
Mhm.
will they, without any extra light, will they, do they have enough strength to grow or get started, or?
I have actually very limited experience myself with growing under LEDs. I know
It's
that
relatively new.
there's full spectrum LEDs that have, or as close as they can get, where it's a whole bunch of different colors, and then there's other types of LED lights that they seem like they tend to be less expensive, that are just red and blue, and sometimes it's just single colors.
I think I'd be better off with the
Yeah, I would say
just get the long.
depending upon how many plants you want to grow.
Yeah.
And that's another one. Talk to the folks at Beck's. They do have a whole bunch of different types, and they can give you probably other advice. But yeah, if you don't get any real sunlight at all in any windows, because then, and that is, we're going to be talking about hardening off in a little while, and that'll be even more important. It's the process of getting them from that grow light to be adjusted to sunlight, which is way, 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 way more intense. But yeah, so supplemental light, and again, that can just be a bulb if you're only doing a couple of little plants, or it could be a huge setup and anything in between. But you can go pretty inexpensive if you're going again with single bulb and things, or it can get crazy expensive. My recommendation is to lean towards the not so expensive side. But then also, if it's something fancy and that it looks like everything else is far more expensive, of that technology is more expensive, and then there's this one that's way, 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 way less expensive, there's a good chance that it's not going to perform quite as well. But yeah, even if you just have fluorescent lights, and basements are a great place to start.
That's what I think I'll do, is fluorescents.
Yeah, if you have like in your basement, or anywhere like, well, I guess it can be warmer than that at this point, but yeah, they do work. Especially, and you're gonna want to keep them close though, or as close as you possibly can to them, just to or not close enough that they get fried, but trying to maximize. Or the closer the lights are, the more like sunlight, not like sunlight. The more intense the light will be, the easier it is for them to eventually get used to the ultimate intensity light, which is the sun.
How many hours a day?
Depend.
24, 6, 4?
Depending upon what you're growing, it could be different things. I usually set mine at about 14 to 16 hours of light, and then kind of just leave it there. There's more involved ways that to either if you're trying to get things to flower earlier or whatever, but you can pretty much leave it at about 14, 16 hours,
Okay.
And it'll be just fine.
And keep the plants close to the bulb.
As much as possible, and that but
12 inches.
you want to get a sense of the heat. So if it's a bulb that it doesn't get all that hot,
Fluorescent.
then you can keep it as long as the plants aren't getting scorched. You can get pretty close. The smaller light, because the bulbs I use are they're about this wide, and I have them about 1.5 inches or so above the onions right now. But a lot of it's just whatever bulb you happen to be using. If it lets off heat, you just don't want to make sure that it doesn't scorch the top of the plants or start to heat them up too much.
What about a heat lamp? Is that too much heat for seedlings?
You mean, I don't know what the spectrum would be on it, or how. Yeah, I really don't know. I know it would definitely add heat, which for certain plants, tomatoes, peppers, those sorts of, the more heat you can put either underneath them or around them, the faster they're going to germinate, because they are, anything that you have seen in the garden that thrives in the heat of the summer, there's a really, really good chance that their seeds also they like a little cooking under them. So once you have your soil and you've had your container, and you have your seeds, and you've got the light, and it is, let's demonstrate that right now. Why not? I'm not advocating for any particular business. This is just what they sell down at Vegas.
Kevin, do you need seeds? Because I have seeds inside.
I'm gonna pretend
Okay.
to seed in this. Alright, so this stuff is particularly dry, also because I wanted to demonstrate it, but when you get your seedling mix or seed starting mix, sometimes it'll have some moisture in it, but there's a really good chance it's going to have a lot of quar and a lot of agents that just keep it pretty dry. It becomes part of why seed starting mix is what it is because it's so fast draining. Because seeds, if water hangs around the seeds for too long, they can rot out. There's all sorts of diseases. I'm actually going to talk about that in just a second. So it will often get quite dry. And one of the most common mistakes that people do is they just take the dry soil, they fill it into wherever it is, and then they plant their seeds, and then they water it. And you will wind up watering more often with more plant failures and all, because these haven't imbibed water. They're a very dry substance, and sometimes you'll wind up with pockets of things further down that never quite get soaked through. And so you want to make sure that your mix is pretty wet. And what you're looking for is for the mix to be not soppy and soaked through, but the sort of moisture where it starts to clump up a little bit. And especially when I'm seeding, I try to bring it to, oh, I didn't have to, a little bit too much. Oh, I might have just done a little bit too much. I want to get it to a place where when you squeeze it in your hand, see that maybe one drop of water that comes down?
That's enough.
That is the moisture level that you want the soil at when you actually pack it into the seedling trays or whatever container you happen to be using to do it. Again, this seems like a little thing or a step that could be skipped. You can skip it. Trust me on this one, having skipped it and then just made the mistake of skipping it. But yeah, the proper moisture is about that. And sometimes with seedling mixtures, like you see, that little pile just picked up good half or, yeah, more than a liter of water. Oh, thank you. And so, I'm going to dig right back in. What am I doing? Alright. And once you've picked your container, I'm just going to use this one right now, so it's right here. Usually fill it up most of the way. You don't want it to be too over the top in the bucket. And then I just drop it a couple of times, you know, not too slammy or anything, but that allows some of the soil to settle down a bit. Then whatever depth or however deep, that will also be on the seed packet, or likely will be on, pretty much always, will be on the seed depth of like how deep into the soil you should plant the seed. Go down no more than whatever depth they said. You actually sometimes you can cheat even a little bit closer to the surface, especially when you're starting seeds or doing seeds and transplants. Pretty safe rule of thumb when you're starting transplants inside is that you don't want to plant the seed any deeper into the soil than than the seed is wide. So if you look at that seed and just see where the widest point is in it, and then it's about that far into the soil. And so sometimes that's why with poppy seeds and things like that, you're just sprinkling them over the top of the soil because they're just dust. They find the cracks in the soil for themselves. And whereas if you're planting, you know, one of the larger beans, kind of shove it a bit down in. And then, yeah, you can either cover over those little holes, or if it's more your style, you can kind of dust some stuff over the top. Watering, my recommendation is to find something that can let out as gentle of a trickle of water as possible. And that if you have a small mister or something like that, or you can just press and it'll water through it. Because in those first couple of, for some seeds it's the first couple of months, but for most of these seeds, for the first couple of days, the first week, they're in very, their little roots are still just teeny tiny. They've barely grabbed into the soil, and too much of a pour in any direction could uproot them and knock them to the side. And let's see. Okay. actually, let's talk about this now. The secret. When I was introduced to this technique, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, it has completely changed the way that I do transplants and the way that I produce most of the transplants for my garden every year. This is a technique called winter sowing. I'm forgetting the name of the woman who kind of became the most famous. Did a lot of research on it. I think she's actually only a little bit upstate, if I remember correctly. But winter sowing is a way of bypassing a lot of what we were just talking about in terms of lights and watering at various times and that sort of thing. What winter sowing does is you create a little greenhouse that actually can just sit out on your back porch. It's a similar idea to a cold frame, or the traditional cold frame, which is just a rectangle of wood with then some glass over top of it that allows for you to start transplants in this. And so you turn a milk jug or another type of jug, but I found these work the best because they don't let too much sunlight in. It doesn't cook the things inside too much. You turn a milk jug into a small cold frame. With this technique, I have started tomatoes and peppers. I've started lettuces and arugulas. I've started multiple types of trees: gray birches, sweet birches, white pines, and it's just amazing because it takes essentially no watering and all those things. But it's also really, really good for if you're growing seeds, especially wildflowers, native plants that have a tendency to have those adaptations where I was talking about before, which is that they need to be frozen a couple of times to really start to germinate that next year or whatever. This allows you to actually grow those plants and things that are very challenging to start inside because you have to take the seed and stick it into the freezer for after scraping it with some sandpaper. Then you put it into the freezer for a month, and then you take it out, and then once you put it under lights, it'll start to grow. Or you can take this sometime, and you can do it all the way up until now. Punch a bunch of holes in the bottom of it, lots and lots and lots of drainage. Maybe not that high. Fill it up to maybe there. There's no hard and fast rule, but you want to give it enough soil. And then, same thing you did there, you just do it right in here. Make sure that it's nice and watered. You give it a nice watering through. Close it up. Take a piece of, I use duct tape. You could use it, but duct tape works pretty well for the amount of time you need it to use. You wrap all the way around that cut that goes there. Take the cap off, and then use some sort of waterproof marker. Make sure to mark whatever's in there, unless you only do one, and then it's easy to remember. And then you just take it, sit it out on your back porch in a shadier spot. You don't want it to be blistering sun initially. And you just leave it. Keep an eye on it, check on it, but eventually, most of the time, the seeds, they'll germinate, and it produces transplants that then don't have to be, which we'll be talking about in a second, they don't have to be hardened off, which is the process of taking the seedlings that you start underneath lights, and we were talking about before, bringing them out to the bright sunlight, which can cause all sorts of, it can cause the leaves to scorch or even the plants to die just trying to move into the sunlight. Things that are grown like this never get transplant shock because they grow outside. Off of one of these, I can get somewhere between 20 to 25 echinacea plants. which for something this small that you don't really need to pay any attention to other than occasionally peeking in the top and seeing if you see any green and how excited you get, you know, when they finally start popping. Initially, since you're letting nature do the work, now what'll happen is that they won't germinate as quickly as they were if they were underneath lights inside in the heat. But in terms of the robustness of the plants, and especially if you're going for some sort of short-term perennial plant or something or a flower that'll last for a little bit longer, or even with tomatoes, I've found that tomatoes that get grown this way wind up being, if you've ever had volunteer tomatoes in your gardens, that they, at a certain point in the season, they actually not only catch up to the transplants that you started inside, but oftentimes they're healthier and are producing more tomatoes than the ones that you spent all of that time working on.
When do you put them out? You have to wait till the frost is passed, or?
Nope. The nice part about this is as long as there's not going to be any deep freezes and that sort of thing, and even then the seeds, as long as the seeds essentially wait till the point that it's warm enough to actually start germinating in there. This is great. Like right now, I would, if you want to grow lettuce or arugula or any of like leafier greens, well, I mean, a lot of that stuff can actually be even direct seeded in not too long of a time. But you actually could. Sometimes these, like, you could do tomatoes in here and could probably still even put them out about now. Because what would happen is they wouldn't germinate in that week.
Right.
They'd essentially wait until the temperature gets to that right point. I've had far more success, mostly success, very few failures with this technique.
You're putting these on a porch, you're not taking them outside.
Oh no, well, they're outside. I put them in a spot where they're protected from the wind so they don't get blown around, and then in a little bit of the shade, but they get all the snow, all the rain, because actually that's why you take the top off here and why you never need to water, is because this don't really need to. I mean, later on, once the plants in here get big enough, and they really leaf out, because once they get big enough, you peel the top back, or you can take it off depending upon what you want, and so they'll already be, leafed out, and by that point, you might need to be watering. But yeah, like basically when you're peeking in the top, over those, weeks or months to just see when the things are actually popping up, or it's weeks for the most part. If you see the top starts to look really dry, or there's been no, rainfall at all, but I've found I've only needed to water things it's usually basically once the tops are coming off. As long as you give it a nice watering when you actually put it in, make sure that the soil has lots in it. Rain and snow will find its way in, as well as the humidity in the air many times, because around here, at nighttime it's, dew is just the name of the game. And so that finds its way in, and yeah,
Do you have jugs out now?
I have been behind on my jug game this year. I have them. I'm going to be using them for slightly different things than most years. Most of the time I use them to do native or a wide variety of things, but especially trees, native flowers, and plants, and semi-wild things that just need a little bit more, or the seeds need to be roughed up a bit more. But to just put them right into my garden, there's a few too many weed seeds, and they wouldn't be able to compete. Whereas in a thing like this, they have their nice little greenhouse. They can take as long as they need, and once they're strong enough, I can put them out.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, this is and it doesn't have to be a milk jug. Again, you could use other things, but I found this just shades out the sun just enough that it doesn't get the cooking effect. Okay, so now that we've touched winter seating, we're going to jump back to our tray inside, underneath the lights. Initially, you're only really going to want to water once you see it start to dry out. If it's more problems are caused for seedlings by overwatering than underwatering, because especially little babies, any sort of fungi that happens to be in the soil, the planting mix, or they just, especially botrytis is one of the big ones. They just reach the mycelium out, and then you come up the next day, and all of your, or a bunch of your little transplants are right at the soil line. They just kind of wilt and go over. That specific issue is called damping off, and it is very, 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 very common, especially when you're just kind of starting out and it's not quite warm enough in the room and the lights are bright enough, but it's like there's not quite enough airflow, and just things that just happen, especially if you're doing it inside of your house on a garden scale. The secret to damping off, or it's more a preventative because I've never lost a seedling that I used this preventative on, chamomile tea. One of the first times that you water your little baby plants, if you make a nice cup of chamomile tea, and then let it cool down and use that to actually water it. You only need to do it really once, especially it's when they're younger.
Straight?
Yeah, you can dilute it a little bit, but it can be pretty strong.
Okay.
Usually, if I'll do, the Pyrex measuring containers, in one of those, I guess the 2.5 cup ones, I like the ones that are like that. I'll probably do. I don't use tea bags because chamomile grows. I grow a lot of chamomile. It would be 2 or 3 tea bags maybe, make a strong brew, but then you can dilute that quite a bit. But the stronger it is, the more antifungal and antibacterial activity you're going to have from it. The plants are totally fine, completely unaffected by it, or as long as you let the water cool down. It's boiling water, maybe that works real good. But yeah, I have never lost a plant to damping off that I used chamomile on. Just one of those tricks, because otherwise, when I don't use chamomile, that is the times that I will still, to this day, lose plants to damping off sometimes. But yeah, chamomile. I think there's other ways. I think you can also, I believe some people sprinkle cinnamon, but I've heard mixed kind of like results on that. I've never really tried it on a larger scale. Plus, cinnamon is more expensive. I don't have cinnamon trees in my backyard, but I do have a lot of chamomile. And damping off is really one of the big things. It's just you don't want to overwater, and you don't want to underwater. You don't want to have them all wilted over like that, because that can be just as bad. But more problems will be from keeping things too wet and keeping things, a little dry. But the ideal moisture really from most of these plants, or all of the basic garden plants, it's having a moist soil, of like just enough that you can tell there is no dryness, but at the same time there's no soppiness, because once things start to, they basically can't breathe, or part of their body can no longer breathe. It starts just choking them. Okay, so once those, however many weeks they're underneath those lights, or if you do have sunlight and you have access to sunlight and there's a really, really bright spot, or that'd be a part of that. We're going to stick with this. once you're done with the lights period and have grown them to whatever height, remembering, raising the lights obviously as the plants get bigger, but always trying to keep those lights as close as possible, without causing any sorts of scorches or problems. The next step is the hardening off process, which is taking those from underneath the lights and getting them ready for the sun. This is there's a lot of different ways that people do it. It's usually somewhere between a week and 2 weeks that you are bringing your transplant outside and then back inside at nighttime for you bring them outside for slowly increasing amounts of time. So let's say usually it takes about a week to a week and a half for me to do it, so I'm going to give rough time on this, but like the first day I would take the transplants and bring them out in the morning time, put them in a place that's kind of shady, still might get some it'll get indirect light because it's the summertime or springtime and things are bright, but put them in a shady spot, not too much wind, kind of protected. You give them half of the day or so, and then bring them back inside to where they were, to a slightly more protected spot. Then the next day it's bringing them out for a few more hours, and then the next day a few more hours, and maybe even into a sunnier spot, until by the end of about a week those plants have or a week and a half, something like that, they are comfortable sitting in full sun, so that you're bringing them out for pretty much the entire day from the beginning until the end, and that they are mostly sitting in as much sun as they will when they're sitting in their pots. So if it's shade plants, then they don't put them out in the sun for too long. But most garden plants, though, and veggies and stuff like that, they want sun. And then the ideal final step is to take that plant the plants once they've been hardened off. The final hardening step is really to take them out, and you can just put them in the place that they actually will be sitting and let them sit there for a day, or by the time they're hardened off, really, you can just pop them in the ground. Hardening off is part of the reason why I've gotten so into winter seeding as much as possible, and winter sowing is there's so many things that do need to be hardened off, or that really need to be started inside or do better, that the more plants that there are that you kind of don't need to pay attention to, don't really need to water, and you don't need to harden them off, you can just pop them out, the better it is. And they might, they flower a week or 2 weeks later than the ones that you started 3 months before under lights. But this is why with tomatoes it's kind of the same thing, that if you don't need tomatoes as soon as you can get tomatoes, and you're okay waiting a week or 2 weeks, might as well do it this way and save a lot of time and effort. But there's a lot to doing it the way that most people do it.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
no problem.